Hey, and welcome back to another creepy TikTok. If you're enjoying these videos, please make sure that you're commenting, and subscribing. Once we reach 100 subscribers, we're going to be having a giveaway, so make sure that you're in it. Alright, enjoy your video.
You ever wondered if vampires are real? Back in the 19th century, a vampire panic began in New England. In Exeter, Rhode Island, a man named George Brown was grief-stricken after his wife Mary and his daughters Mary Olive and Mercy all lost their lives due to tuberculosis, or consumption, as it was called back then. Pretty soon, George's son Edwin also fell gravely ill, so the locals decided to take action. The townspeople believed that consumption wasn't what had cursed the Brown family, but rather something more sinister. Locals began to fear that one of the Brown women was actually a vampire who had begun feasting on the rest of the family, so they convinced George to let them exhume their graves. On March 17, 1892, a group of men went to Chestnut Hill Cemetery and dug up the bodies. In Mary and Mary Olive's caskets, they found nothing but skeletons, but the townspeople were shocked by the sight of Mercy Brown, who appeared to be in perfect condition. There was still blood in the girl's veins and a flush to her cheeks. The men removed her heart and liver, and inside they found clotted blood. A local doctor insisted this was perfectly normal considering the frigid temperatures and the fact that Mercy had only been gone for a couple months. But the townspeople took it as a sure sign that Mercy Brown was a vampire, so they burned her heart and liver and mixed the ashes with water. Then they fed the drink to Edwin to cure him. But it didn't help. Edwin expired a few months later. But ever since, the legend of Mercy Brown, the vampire of Rhode Island, has lived on.
Some company secrets that they definitely don't want you knowing about. Sprite changed their bottle from green to clear specifically to make it harder for you to spot them in landfills. Every single retail store's clothes you buy are dirty. There's no way for them to wash or disinfect them after they get off the truck or when they get returned. Olive Garden breadsticks are just store-bought Franz brand breadsticks covered in margarine. Credit card companies frequently change your ARP without even telling you, but they'll do it 3 or 4 decimal places out so you don't notice. So instead of charging 15.99%, they'll charge you 15.9994%, which doesn't seem like a lot, but if they do it to all their customers, they earn so much money. Unless your dog got into a fight, dog boarders and groomers are just going to tell you they were a good boy or girl, even if they weren't. Casino security cameras can see everything, down to the dots on a dice. And their policy is to not look down women's blouses, but 80% of audits result in a return, which is somehow comforting but also terrifying. Teachers are so burnt out that they'd rather give a student a passing grade than deal with the whole process of holding them back.
This is the Claire Miller case, the TikToker who stabbed her sister to death. This is Claire Miller, and in 2021, she stabbed her sister to death. Claire was just an average 14-year-old girl who went to school, had friends, and did normal teenage things. And she also posted on TikTok a bunch, which accumulated a small fan base. And there are pages still active today reposting and sharing her TikToks. But she had a disturbing side of her that nobody knew about, and in 2021 that side of her would come out. Claire had an older sister named Helen who was 19 and Claire was 14. And what makes this case even sadder is that her sister Helen had cerebral palsy. But randomly on February 2nd, 2021, Claire just randomly snapped. She grabbed a knife in her house and stabbed her 19-year-old sister in the neck with it. Claire then called the police and turned herself in, but she was completely hysterical on the phone, claiming, "I killed my sister, you need to get here right now." And when the authorities arrived, Claire was standing outside completely covered in blood, and there was also blood all over the snow on the ground. Her sister was then found inside the house with the knife still in her neck. Authorities have gone on the record after this murder stating how this case is so unusual because it's a sister murdering her older sister, and Claire was only 14 years old when she committed this crime, which is just extremely young. Obviously, Claire's parents were devastated because not only did they lose one daughter, they lost their other daughter because Claire was arrested. Claire was sentenced to 12.5 years to 40 years in prison. This case is just horrible, and it just goes to show that you never know what somebody is really going through or thinking. I feel so bad for the parents and the sister, and may Helen rest in peace.
Even though Chernobyl was a huge disaster, few people really know what happened that day. So let's get into it. You might know that on April 26, 1986, they were ironically performing a safety test on reactor 4 at Chernobyl. But in the process, they made the reactor super fragile, including taking out the control rods, which were supposed to moderate the reaction. Now, these control rods were boron carbide, but they had cheaper graphite tips. Cool, no big deal. Graphite just accelerates nuclear reactions. So when the reaction started to get out of control, they pushed all the control rods back in at once to moderate the reaction. Except, nope, the graphite sped it up, causing the explosion. It's hard to put into words just how massive that explosion was, but let me try. It blew off the 1,000-ton plate covering the reactor core. There was no safety container around the reactor, so isotope fires raged for weeks. The very few survivors reported seeing a bluish light in the reactor hall, which came from the ionization of the air. They said it flooded into infinity. Nearby residents almost immediately experienced vomiting, headaches, and a metallic taste in their mouth. That's just the immediate effects. We'll get into the aftermath later.
Here are some of old Hollywood's most scandalous secrets. Number 1. When he was 9 years old, Cary Grant's mother disappeared. At first his father told him that she'd gone to a seaside resort, but then later switched his story and claimed that she died. Grant believed this until he heard his father's horrifying deathbed confession. His mother was still alive, locked up in a lunatic asylum. Number 2. Anthony Perkins shared a passionate romance with Hollywood heartthrob Tab Hunter. They kept their affair a secret from everybody, and to their friends they were always just good college buddies. Number 3. Kim Novak and Sammy Davis Jr. fell hopelessly in love, but the prejudices of the time destroyed them. When producer Harry Cohn discovered them, he hired the mob to threaten Davis, ultimately forcing him to marry another woman. Number 4. Richard Burton wrote more than 40 poignant love letters to Elizabeth Taylor, even though he was married to another woman. However, she didn't receive his last letter until after he'd already died, and she took that secret to her grave. She refused to reveal its exact contents, slept with it next to her bed, and was eventually buried with it.
Scary Maine Urban Legends. The ghost ship of the Damariscotta is a ghostly vessel that appears on the Damariscotta River. This ship is said to be the ghost ship of a pirate ship that was sunk by the British Navy many years ago. This occurred in the early 1850s when the 210-foot ship named the Ellen Austin was strolling through the river on their way to New York. After a few days, their ship got lost in a heavy mist, and when they came out, they seemed to have just vanished out of thin air. Then 2 days later, their ship was back, and when an investigation was done, it was found that no crew was on board. Another odd thing was that everything looked perfectly normal, like there wasn't any sort of panic or whatever. However, none of the ship's logs were found, only giving its story more mystery. Nowadays, residents around the river claim to see a ghostly ship in the distance, usually when it's foggy, pointing out responsibility to the Ellen Austin, saying it's on its way to its watery grave.
This is how long you would survive these things on average. 72 years after being born. 72 years after being born if you didn't have a phone. 52 years of being obese. 50 years of consistent alcoholism. 30 years of eating McDonald's for every meal every day. 15 years with untreated syphilis. 10 years being imprisoned in North Korea. 5 years without a stomach. 3 years after having an aneurysm. 3 years of having a wedgie. 2.5 years without human interaction. 2 years without hygiene. 18 months without a heart. 18 months without any sunlight. 16 months after asbestos exposure. 1 year without the sun. 6 months if the earth had no ozone layer. 90 days without protein. 50 days without pooping. 45 days after eating only celery. 40 days if exposed to too much radiation. 30 days after eating only sugar. 21 days if you were starving. 21 days without sodium in your body. 14 days after being bitten by a black widow. 14 days in a zombie apocalypse. 14 days with a blood clot in your arteries. 10 days if you ate a poisonous mushroom. 10 days without any sleep. 9 days if you only drank your own pee. 7 days without water. 7 days with unresolved food poisoning. 7 days eating just poop. 6 days without both lungs. 5 days in constant temperatures over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 days stranded in the jungle. 4 days without peeing. 4 days in a desert with no water. 4 days of non-stop exercise. 4 days after becoming a hostage. 3 days after a red scorpion sting. 3 days trapped in a tanning bed. 3 days inside a whale's stomach. 2 days of being stranded in the ocean. 2 days after being skinned alive. 28 hours hanging upside down. 24 hours after a Botox incident. 24 hours after being impaled. 24 hours after having 1 liter of water per hour. 21 hours after a rattlesnake bite. 16 hours at the top of Mount Everest. 12 hours of running without food, water, or rest. 12 hours of stopped blood flow. 8 hours after alcohol poisoning. 8 hours after a heart attack. 5.5 hours after being buried alive. 4 hours after drinking bleach. 4 hours after drinking battery acid. 4 hours after drinking 5 shots of pure 100% alcohol. 3 hours of sitting in a sauna. 3 hours of being in a hurricane without shelter. 2 hours after eating a blowfish. 1 hour after drinking gasoline. 1 hour after a cocaine overdose. 40 minutes stuck in quicksand. 30 minutes after a king cobra bite. 30 minutes after a magnitude 9 earthquake, 20 minutes in the Antarctic waters, 18 minutes in an avalanche, 15 minutes after a severe allergic reaction, 15 minutes after your heart stops beating, 15 minutes in a stampeding crowd, 14 minutes in a sinking car, 10 minutes deep underwater, 10 minutes in temperatures under negative 40 degrees, 9 minutes after licking a poisonous frog, 8 minutes in an oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 minutes after a gunshot wound, 6 minutes after a great white shark bite, 5 minutes until you bleed to death, 5 minutes without breathing, 5 minutes after a lion attack, 5 minutes after lethal injection, 5 minutes in a tsunami, 4 minutes with no heartbeat, 4 minutes of being eaten by piranhas, 4 minutes after being swallowed by a snake whole, 4 minutes after a stab wound, 3 minutes after smoke inhalation, 3 minutes after strangulation, 3 minutes after choking on food, 3 minutes after consuming cyanide, 2 minutes after sitting in boiling water, 2 minutes after a box jellyfish sting, 2 minutes on the planet of Mercury, 2 minutes after a slit wrist, 1 minute after being burned alive, 1 minute after a 120-volt electric shock, 50 seconds in a microwave, 45 seconds if gravity disappeared, 40 seconds after being hit by a train, 40 seconds after drowning, 40 seconds after hanging, 30 seconds after falling into a volcano, 30 seconds after the electric chair, 30 seconds after the guillotine, 20 seconds in a vacuum, 15 seconds in space without a suit, 14 dramatic seconds after being struck by a lightsaber, 3 seconds after being cut in half, 1.5 seconds of your organs being torn apart in 14G acceleration, 1 second on Jupiter, 1 second on Venus, 0.15 seconds after a plane crash, 0.1 seconds after jumping off a high cliff, 0.1 seconds after being struck by lightning, 0.05 seconds after a bullet to the head, 0.04 seconds after a firing squad, 0.01 seconds on the sun, 0.01 seconds after a nuclear blast, 0.0001 seconds in a black hole.